You're going to experience a lot of changes throughout your life, and a lot of times this change can be uncomfortable or overwhelming, but it's also inevitable. It's always good to have your own things that remain constant to fall back on whenever change becomes too much for you. As someone who just started her first year of college, I find myself experiencing a lot of these sort of overwhelming changes. So to help deal with that, I fall back on my own personal constant, which is, you probably guessed it, video games. But it's not just any video games. They're specifically my comfort games. I define comfort games as familiar games that you can lose yourself in. Not all comfort games are necessarily easy, and not all easy games are particularly comfortable to everyone either. They're just games that you can always rely on and come back to whenever you need to escape the real world. So because this is so relevant to me right now, I felt like I should talk about what games I consider to be my comfort games. So the first comfort game is probably pretty obvious to anyone who knows me and knows my channel, and it's Super Mario Galaxy. It's got the obvious benefit of being really nostalgic to me. I'm sure a lot of other people have really nostalgic experiences with this game as well. It was one of the first games I ever beat. But it's not just nostalgia that makes this a comfort game. Super Mario Galaxy's theming also contribute to it being a comfort game for me. I think the space setting really helps to create a barrier between the real world and the game's world, because even within the game you can see Mario getting shot out into space far away from the Earth and everything down there, and it really makes it feel like all your problems, everything that you're worrying about down on Earth is completely gone, and all that's relevant right now is whatever strange planet you found yourself on. And the game's able to be so far out and wacky with its locations, because it's in space, and there's a lot we don't really know about space, so the possibilities for theming are endless. And all these places aren't only engaging visually. You can't talk about Super Mario Galaxy without talking about the music. And both the classical and sort of alien electronic music complement the worlds really well, even if both types of music are pretty different from each other. And they help keep me immersed in these surreal locations. It's not a difficult game. I was able to beat it when I was 8 with really no trouble, and I'm pretty bad at video games. But its theming and overall satisfyingly simple gameplay keeps me entertained while also preventing me from struggling too much with any particular section of the game. And I guess while we're on the topic of Mario, we could also talk about my one multiplayer game that I consider comforting. And that, of course, is Mario Kart, and specifically Mario Kart 8. I've played almost every Mario Kart, and they're all fun in their own way, but I believe 8 just hits the sweet spot, with being visually appealing, while also streamlining the game that we all know and love. It's super easy to just play it with anyone. If you walk into a room and say, hey, who wants to play Mario Kart? Chances are people are going to raise their hand, people are going to say, oh, me. People who've never even seen a video game are probably going to be like, huh, maybe I'll give it a try. It's really hard to find people who don't like it, and that's part of the reason why it's such a comforting multiplayer game to me. It somehow never gets boring, even though it's such a familiar game. I like how it's typically not as competitive as Smash. Even though it has its competitive side, it's not like it bleeds into all groups of people playing the game. And because of this, it's easier to just have mindless fun while you're playing it. Even though I say Mario Kart is mindless, it creates this sort of artificial stress, and it manages to temporarily replace the real-life stress, and in my opinion, I think that's a pretty good trade-off. So moving away from Nintendo, my next comfort game is Portal, which I actually played for the first time last year because I didn't really play a whole lot of non-Nintendo games throughout most of my life, and I sort of semi-recently started getting into them. But even though I played it for the first time last year, it's such a short game, and I've been able to play through the whole thing a good handful of times. And even after replaying it so many times in a relatively short amount of time, it still manages to be satisfying. And this is probably because of the scientific atmosphere that makes you feel like you're being productive, and the usage of the Source Engine sound effects, which I absolutely love. It's also just really fun to experiment with the portal gun and the game's physics. It's just kind of a sandbox where you can do anything without overwhelming you with choice. You're limited in how much you can explore and how many things you can interact with, but the physics engine opens up so many possibilities to what you can do. And I find it really relaxing to just find a room, go play some portals, maybe drop some stuff in there, maybe drop a block or 2 or 3 or however many this is, and just make a giant mess. It really doesn't require any thought, but it's so fun to just create this contained chaos. Makes me feel like a little kid. I love it. And the whole game's got this sort of mysterious and cold atmosphere, and the first time I played it, it was a little creepy. But the second time and third time and every other time I've played it, it's surprisingly calming. Now this is the case with replaying any game because you already know what's going to happen at the end, so there isn't really as much of this dread that it has the first time. You start to notice the humor and the writing a little bit more, and it just kind of has more of a laid-back tone every other time you play it. and some of the areas don't have as much shock value as they used to have. Especially the later part of the game, which anyone who's played Portal knows, it deviates from the test chamber thing where all the levels are numbered, and you start to explore the Aperture Science back rooms. The first time I played it, I felt like I was breaking the game. But once you get used to the unfamiliar and hostile environment, it feels really nice to know your way around it. It's like when you move to an unfamiliar place, and you have to piece together this mental map as you walk around it until eventually you know it really well. Huh, that concept sounds a little familiar to me. Okay, my next comfort game is a very bad game, and that game is Skyrim. I know people always meme this game for being released. How many times now? I have no idea. Even though it's objectively a really bad game, it does have a really good atmosphere. When I'm playing Skyrim and I'm taking in all the mountains and trees and rivers and waterfalls, and crawling through those dusty underground dungeons, and then eventually emerging and finding myself in some warm tavern, it really does feel like I'm there. It feels like a separate life. When I was younger and I didn't really play as many games and wasn't really aware of as many games, I'd always imagined this ideal game in my head, just a generic fantasy game where you walk around, you use magic, you play with swords, you explore. I always pictured this ideal game, and I always wanted to find it and play it. So when I finally did play Skyrim, it felt pretty familiar because I had been imagining this game in my head. But since I hadn't played it and didn't know a whole lot about it, it was still really new and exciting. It was such a joy to explore. To the player, everything's pretty low stakes. It's not a challenging game at all. You can make it challenging. On the default difficulty, it's really not difficult. But even though for the player it's low stakes, canonically everything is high stakes. And it really makes you feel important and accomplished, even though it's ironically a pretty relaxing game. There's all these quick bits of progression that give you little shots of dopamine every time you finish a quest, every time you level up, every time you find an item or some money. It sets off this little spark in my brain, and it never gets old, even if it's objectively a pretty repetitive game. And also, because Skyrim is a really bad game, and because it's so broken, it's also just comic relief too, and it makes me laugh. You discover more bugs every time you play this game, and that's an adventure in itself. But back to the immersiveness, you spend a lot of times in some towns and landmarks, and when you return to them after an adventure, it gives this sense of meta comfort on top of the comfort from real life that you get from playing the game. The last comfort game I'd like to talk about is Hollow Knight. The whole game has this dangerous but also surprisingly calming atmosphere throughout it. This is mostly due to the beautiful hand-drawn graphics and art style. It's very easy on the eyes, and the ambient music is the same for the ears. And all of this contributes to building an interesting and unique world. And even though this world is unfamiliar to anyone who hasn't played Hollow Knight, because I have not seen a game with the same kind of atmosphere as this one, it almost feels like home when you're replaying it because of how much exploring and backtracking you do during your playthrough. And even though the first time you play Hollow Knight, it's a pretty challenging game, after you play it for a while, it's not as difficult as it was before. But the sense of satisfaction from fighting the bosses is still there because the game doesn't get easier, you get better at it. And I love this sense of accomplishment you get from looking back at something that was once difficult to you. I'm so thankful that I've had an opportunity to build up this collection of comfort games. And I'm also thankful that you took some time out of your life to hear me talk about them. These games can always help me escape from anything that's stressing me out in the present. Maybe get some nostalgia and visit the past. And they're just some good pure fun to fill in those dull days that come up every once in a while. My list of comfort games will probably change a little bit over the years as my taste and desires change, but I'll always have something I can play to step into a different reality and leave all the change and unpredictability of my own.